We are really excited to be here, and kudos for all the great work that Red, Wine, and Blue is doing. I'm a native of Chicago, but grew up across the South. I have a lot of respect for the work that suburban women do, especially within this time frame of radical expansion of extremism, especially when we're seeing that target be laser focused on our students and students' education across the P-12 system as well as higher ed. The Education Trust, the organization that both myself and Carl are a part of, is a national education organization devoted to policy remedies for students who are underserved from underserved communities across the country, in addition to advocacy and civil rights and justice. And there isn't a time where that has been more real and more focused than what we're seeing right now with the attacks on the public school system at both the K-12 level as well as at the higher ed level. And tonight we're going to start a little bit of good trouble. We're really excited to be here, but I did want to shout out all the people. The representation we have in this group is amazing. I'm looking at where everybody's from in the chat. Kudos to you all for being able to assemble such a great group. There's so many things that we want to cover tonight, but I also want to, off the top, tell you all if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, but also to let us know towards the end what those are. We're going to reserve a good 10 to 15 minutes to take audience questions because I think that's extremely important. But to do the lay of the land, both myself and Carl, who I'm extremely proud to have here today, have worked in large urban school districts, me in the Chicago Public Schools and him in Baltimore. I want to make sure that, we touch on why it's important to not only advocate during this time for our youth, but also to understand what we are facing is chronic. What we are facing is extremely strategic. And what we are facing is not only a crisis of civil rights and justice, but also one of moral character. And it's by design. The threats that face our public school system are nothing new, to be honest. We've always had funding threats. We've always had threats to civil rights. We've always had threats that upended the access and protections of students of color. But what we do have now that's a bit different is, unfortunately, a White House that stands behind it, and in some cases, a Supreme Court and the judicial system writ large that does as well. I want to, first of all, touch on some of the threats to funding. We all heard after the election of 2024 that this president was very much geared towards dismantling public education as we know it. He said it on the campaign cycle, he said it on the trail, and since he got elected, with Doge efforts, giving him a great assist, he has done everything he can to make public access to education become harder and harder every day. One of the first things that this president did when he got into office was sign a series of executive orders, all aimed at dismantling the public education system as we know it, from threats to DEI, to limiting what teachers can teach, to placing several restrictions on not only curriculum, but also the types of books that our kids have access to. In addition to cutting off research and grant funding that helps to set our young people on a path to success, be it whether it's in science and STEM-based careers or whether it is in careers and things like law. We want to make sure that we not only talk about the importance of these things, but also why these things are being attacked. The White House has gone out of its way to dismantle public education. We're talking over $6.2 billion in cuts. And that may not sound, I don't know who on this call this doesn't sound large to, but for anybody who doesn't think that it's large, it is massive. Project 2025 outlined specifically what areas he wanted to cut. And a lot of those cuts are in research funding, but several others are in funding to access for the very programs that students who look like both Carl and I would have had access to. I think that it matters that we delve into that specifically, just because those threats to funding are more than threats at this point. This is a president and an administration that is trying to find DEI wherever it may lie. I call it the DEI Red Scare, but you can call it whatever you want. At this point, it is. If you're teaching about honest history, and I hate that term, I call history history, because if it's not honest, then it didn't happen. What we do know is that civil rights and justice matters, that slavery did happen. It's America's original sin. It's a very harmful, shameful part, and we should all be frustrated that that happened in what I consider the greatest country on earth. But we can't talk about America without talking about slavery. We can't talk about the dawn of this country without also talking about the Trail of Tears and what was done to Indians and what placed them in reservations, what was done to Native Americans, in addition to Chinese internment camps. We can't talk about the history of our community. We can't talk about culture without talking about some of the harshest parts of American history that unfortunately people today do not want to realize or think that it makes us weaker if we talk about it. That's not who we are as a people. America is great because America went through great pains to get there. And if we do not teach that truth to our young people, we do not teach that truth to the folks who are rising up in the ranks now across our public education system, we run the risk of having those same experiences again and them not understanding how to get out of them or how we got there. With that being said, and I know that somebody dropped in here IDEA, as someone who has an older sibling who is on the autism spectrum, who has developmental delay, it remains frustrating to me on a personal level that we are in a fight to protect funds for students with disabilities. We are in a fight for people to understand that those funds that are being targeted, when we talk about civil rights and justice and what's happening to our students who have developmental issues or who are on IEPs, are not being understood by this administration or by a current Secretary of Education who doesn't even know what those things mean. We cannot have this conversation without first going into why these threats to funding are occurring. And in large part, it is because we have an administration and a current Department of Education leadership that does not believe in focusing on our children, that does not believe in providing resources, the necessary resources that the Fed has for years now provided to ensure that not only are school districts competitive, but also that school districts that have a larger portion of students with disabilities, that have a larger portion of students who are underserved, or a larger portion of students who are SNAP beneficiaries, are able to receive the resources that they need. And frustrating for everybody on this call, and I think particularly those of us who work in school districts where we know what it's like for over 60% of your students to come to school and not have a place to go home and lay their head down, where we know what it's like to have washers and dryers and after school resource programs to ensure that those kids can go to school with clean clothes, where we know what it's like to be able to fund food shelters and food resources for students who may not get an extra meal at home. Those are the types of students and the types of communities that many of us serve and have worked in for a long time, and what brings us to this conversation today. But in this administration and in this Department of Ed, we have a belief that our public schools are no good, that the students who are there are not worth our time, and that an overhaul of the public schools needs to happen, and that overhaul takes place with privatization, that overhaul takes place when we ensure that vouchers are available, which we know are underfunded for most kids who are from impoverished districts. But they're not worried about that. They're more concerned with ensuring that students who have access and who have parents of means are the only people who have access to that next rung of employment and that next rung of success. And to say that it is absolutely okay to cut off opportunity for young people is something we should all be against. And it's not just Black and brown students, it's all students. We are here to represent students regardless of where their families come from, regardless of their family's immigration status, regardless of their family's wealth and means, to ensure that all of those students have the access to the type of opportunity that the American dream that we tell everybody about, that it can become reality regardless of where you come from and what you look like. And unfortunately, in this day and age and in this administration, we are fighting against very, very strong headwinds and funding structures that are designed to eradicate that opportunity and that promise. And I'm going to turn it over to Carl to go in a little bit about what we're seeing, not only within the civil rights realm, but also as these DEI attacks continue.
Thank you, Amisha, and good evening, everyone. I would like to even go back to some of the things that Amisha laid out for us around the civil rights, what's happening. And so what we know is that there's been attacks on Civil Rights Office, Office of Civil Rights, which has been responsible for enforcing the federal rights against age and sex, disabilities, race, all those things, all those demographics of students. And the reason why that staff is important is half of that staff was laid off, right? And what that means is there are no accountability folks, or less folks that can hold this administration accountable, less folks that can hold states accountable, less folks that can hold schools accountable to provide the services that are due to students with disabilities, that are due to students who may be having race or discrimination issues or gender issues. That is why that staff was important. So the attack on that department and that team, and even on their regional offices being shut down, that's a major problem, because that means that there's an underrepresentation and less accountability for student groups that are most vulnerable. What that also means is there could be an increase in discriminatory practices because there's no one to enforce the laws. Also, biased discipline practices can increase with no resolution. Also, advanced coursework. Students who are seeking to engage in those classes, or students who may be wrongfully kept out in those classes, are now there's no accountability system to come down on states and districts to enforce the laws there. And so this is a major issue for us. Another thing is that what happens is there's a reduced capacity to investigate the discrimination, which means that there could be thousands of cases filed, but who's going to follow up with those students? Who's going to hold those states and districts accountable? And so that is why it's important that we don't just sit back and say, hey, well, what can we replace it with? No, we don't want to replace it with anything. We need these measures in place because that's what accountability is for, right? It's to make sure that students have the opportunities that they need to get the education that they're due. What it also happens is with the staff being laid off, there's a loss of expertise, right? There are people who specialize in making sure students get the services and supports that they need. There are people who specialize in holding states and districts accountable and enforcing these policies. And what happens is if our OCR or the Office of Civil Rights is replaced with something else or moved to another department, what happens is people begin to operate however they want to in a way that doesn't best serve students, but in a way that best supports the administration and their desires. And so that's just to say that we have something in place. But what we need in place is accountability to make sure that all students are served and supported from the perspective and they're not discriminated against for their race, gender, sex, or disabilities.
No, just to piggyback off of that, and just to be fair in this conversation, when he's talking about some of these overarching civil rights cases, be it whether it's based on race, gender, disability status, so on and so forth, many of these cases are not going to be heard. In large part, it is because Doge laid everybody off and then Trump cut everybody else. But in addition to that, it's also many of these cases are not new. Some of these are backlog cases from years ago. So we've seen cases across the country, but I will point to Texas in particular because one of the reasons I originally moved to DC from Chicago in 2018 was to work on cases specifically in civil rights in the pre-K system, where we saw that there were 3-year-olds who were being attacked, who were being pushed out of the system, race-based cases, in large part where these 3-year-olds were being treated as grown men when it came to violence in daycare centers. How you are being, considered somebody who's violent, brute force as a 3-year-old kid who is literally not even knee high is not only wild and outrageous, but it raised the ire of the federal government because these kids were literally being removed in handcuffs at 3 across the state of Texas. I think that we have to be very, very realistic in understanding like some of the egregiousness of these cases and why it matters to have a Office of Civil Rights that enforces the law but also protects young people, because once those kids are, incurring such extreme legal precedent as young people, it becomes extremely hard for them to see themselves in that classroom. It becomes extremely hard for them to trust teachers. It becomes extremely hard for them to have some of the benefits of education because that same system that they believed in not only lost their faith but also treated them as though they were violent criminals. And I think that it's very important for us when we have this conversation to not only recognize the importance of an education system that not only teaches you, but also one that enriches your skills, one that helps you to believe in a future and to see opportunity beyond what you see in your neighborhood, beyond what you see in your community, beyond your personal background, but not one that makes you feel as though being in a Black body or being in a Latino body or being in an LGBT body makes you inherently wrong, makes you inherently somebody to be targeted. And unfortunately, what we see in this system is that time and time again, that happens to be the case. That's why we're fighting for the protections of those students. That's why we also want there to be a curriculum that reflects the students in your classroom. When we have, and the reality is, over 70% of the American teaching body is white females, but the majority of kids in your classroom are diverse students. That doesn't mean that we automatically want to eradicate all white female teachers. No, but what we do want is for there to be more diversity in the classroom. But we also want is for those white female teachers to understand what it means to be a Black student in that classroom, to be a Latino student in that classroom, to understand that that cultural background and that experience brings with it some significant challenges, and that you have to see yourself reflected not only in that curriculum to understand it and be able to translate it, but also to feel like that classroom is welcoming to you as a student who comes from the background of somebody who in front of that classroom has not had that experience. So it's not DEI in the sense of we just want to, eradicate whiteness, which is what we've heard from this administration often. It is, if a classroom is to be welcoming to the society that these students are going to walk out into, when we have a global economy, where we have a workforce where people come from various different backgrounds, the only way to do that is to have a curriculum and a focus area that also showcases diversity, that also showcases that people with different backgrounds and experiences bring different ideas and strategies. We need to be able to make that case, but we also need to be able to work in an environment where, unfortunately, race is the name of the game, and there are people who are weaponizing that against us.
I want to also piggyback off what you're talking about here, Amisha, to this point of representation in the classroom, because there are so many implications to not having our students represented in the classroom, both in personhood, right? Not just from a teacher standpoint, but also in other resources and adults in the school building, right? What research tells us is that when students are represented in the staff, especially our English learner populations, right? Like our Latino students or our students from other spaces across the world, what we learn is that when they're able to see themselves and when adults are able to see them and to connect with them and their families, they are more engaged. They are able to better engage with the curriculum and show up daily. What we also know is that when students are not represented well and they cannot connect with their teachers, be it culturally or just being misunderstood from a communal and cultural standpoint, what we know is that leads to chronic absenteeism, which is a major conversation in education today, right? Everyone has been talking about chronic absenteeism post-pandemic and how the data doubled post-pandemic, and everyone there's a message and rhetoric being spread right now that it's never going to get better, it's not getting better, no one's doing anything, but that's simply not true. What we found is that although the numbers have been slow to come down, coming out of the pandemic, we were at about 28% chronically absent across the country. And where we are right now, countrywide, is about 23%, which tells me that we have improved. And what I want everyone to understand is, although 23% sounds like a lot, especially being up from 16% pre-pandemic, that is thousands of kids and students who have returned to their school communities. That means that our states, our districts, and our schools have found ways to connect with students and their families and to engage them and ensure that they're getting the supports that they need to show up daily. That means that the relationships are happening. That means that some of our resources are going to the students that need them the most, because what we know is that students of color, students from low income backgrounds, and students with disabilities are the student groups who are most chronically absent, right? But we need to ensure that those are the student groups that are getting the resources that states and districts are setting aside for attendance work. So I would love to continue to sit here for a moment and continue to talk about that, because Amisha also brought up how some of our students were being arrested and treated from a discipline perspective. And that even connects to our earlier conversation around the Office of Civil Rights staff. And with that lack of accountability from a discipline standpoint, what happens is the discipline practices that are happening on a school level, if there's not a high level of accountability there with how adults are engaging with children, right? What that does is that breaks a student's relationship with the school environment. When you are mistreated in a school environment and treated punitively, because as a former teacher, as someone who's been on a school leadership team and worked in a district office, I can tell you that there are alternative ways than the punitive practices that are used across the country. And you can use our alternative practices to engage with students. And actually, what we found is that students actually learn how not to repeat the behaviors that led to the discipline in the first place when you engage in alternative discipline practices such as restorative practices. being able to have a conversation, and that means that you hold the student accountable, and they hold the responsibility, but there's also an opportunity for them to be restored back to the community. Some people think that that's soft. Some people think that that lacks accountability, but what it does is it puts the ownership on the student, and they can learn how it's bigger than your behavior, but your behavior is impacting this community. And so I'm not going to get too deep in those weeds, but what I will say is there are different ways to support our students from a discipline perspective. And discipline is a major conduit of chronic absenteeism. Chronic absenteeism is when students are missing 10% or more of the school year, meaning if there are 180 days in your school year, once you miss 18 days, you are considered chronically absent. That can also happen by missing 2 days per month. So I know schools down south, a lot of those schools started in August, and schools closer up north started in September or late August. And so by now, let's say you've missed 2 days in August, 2 days in September, and 2 days already in October. You would be considered at risk of becoming chronically absent. That student would be. And so, what we would hope would happen is someone at that school community is engaging these students and families to figure out, hey, what's going on with your regular attendance? And the reason why that matters in this conversation, as we're talking about students of color and how they're being attacked and targeted in this administration, the reason being is there's a narrative that students just don't want to come to school. But as someone who has spent time in schools, I just don't believe that. But to Amisha's earlier point, I will say that we have to do the work to hold our schools accountable to have engaging curriculum and to become safe environments that make our students want to engage. Someone put in the chat earlier about school to prison pipeline. Is your school so rigid? Are the safety policies so rigid to where your students and families don't feel welcome? There are some teachers who don't like going to their schools because of the security measures. And what we found in our research is that it's not about all these security measures. What is it about? About building relationships with students and families, making sure every adult and student has a safe space and a person, a peer-to-peer, adult to student to adult, student to student relationship that they can lean into. Because we found that those are the measures that reduce the need for all these high risk safety measures, such as metal detectors and lots of security, and all these other things that make students feel safe. There's even talk about panic buttons being put in classrooms, which all those things could go very wrong. And I do understand that about the school shootings, but what we found is that these security measures are not preventing school shooting. What they're doing is just criminalizing students, right? But these are even things that the administration wants to fund. But it's a lot easier and it's more beneficial to invest in building relationships, to support our teachers in having the tools that they need, investing in professional development versus metal detectors, right? On how to build relationships with students and how to create a climate and community of belonging. These are better long-term investments because not only does it keep your students safe, but it keeps your students more connected in the school environment. And if students feel safe and they feel like they belong, I promise you, they won't even allow themselves or their peers to ruin the environment.
I was going to add to that because I know that somebody here was asking about how they could get involved. Go to your school board meetings, go to your city council meetings or your education committee meetings. As somebody who does not have children, I can tell you there isn't a school board or education meeting I have not been a part of since I graduated college. And in large part, it is because I know that where goes education, so goes your community. If your education system is struggling, if your students are struggling, what you see is business infrastructure leave. What you see is housing values and property values go down. What you see is a level of dereliction of the community that you cannot get back. And I have always believed that our strongest natural resource that this country has, it is not in minerals, it is not in wealth, it is in the products of our youth. If we allow them to not be able to see their full potential, this nation is done. And then when I say them, I mean all of our youth. We have to be as invested in their futures as we are in our stock market, as we are in where we choose to live, as we are in what car we choose to drive. Our young people, whether you are a parent or not, whether your kids are grown, it doesn't matter. We have to be there for these young people. And I will say that Carl hit on something that's very important. We also have to make school feel comfortable for them. We also have to make them see themselves reflected in it. We also have to teach and be able to reach out to parents. That parental structure is extremely important. And our school system was not built on bringing in non-traditional parents. Our school system was built on a two-parent household structure where dad went to work every day and mom was at home taking care of the family. That has not been the case for some communities and forever. For some, it was never their case to begin with, but we do have to adapt. And our school model in terms of bringing in families has to adapt to women in the workforce, has to adapt to a schedule where some parents have to work more than one job, has to adapt to a schedule where grandparents, uncles, other community members are helping to raise these kids, because that is the environment in which we stand. And we have to be able to create those resources that make it easier for them to get involved. That is on the school, not on the parent, not on the guardian. We also have to understand the importance of wraparound resources. Carr was a real teacher. I'll say this. I was a teacher in after school programs, so I wasn't necessarily a real one, but I did 21st century learning programs, specifically in literacy and math, because it mattered that students were not always able to get every bit of enrichment in the short hours you have in a school day. So if you're already falling behind, it matters that those 21st century programs are there in your school system for after school and summer enrichment work. It matters that you have caring community members who are there to help students who may be falling behind in reading, writing, math, to get up to speed. We partnered with the local institutions, made sure that, these students got the level of assistance that they need, but also wrapped around resources that help them to understand their environment. As somebody who lost my younger brother to suicide at 12, I understand what mental health resources mean for young people. This is not some frou-frou by design. We're adding things here that, students don't need. There was billions of dollars put in place after the pandemic to ensure that our young people would have the support they deserved and they needed, because a lot of people lost their grandparents, a lot of people lost their parents, a lot of people lost that interaction that matters so much because they were away from their friends, they were away from community, they were not involved in sports, they had to stay home. We know that that hurt our young people. You don't just go back to school and everything click back. You need a level of support and those resources to make it make sense. I know it's hard for adults. Imagine what it's like for a kid. So it makes sense for us to fight for those funds, which this president fought very hard to end, in mental health resources in our schools. That literally puts kids' lives at risk. That's not something any of us can stand for. So raise your voices in your local communities, at your school boards, at your city councils, but also in your state legislatures. Because if we're not fighting for these kids, who will? It matters for us to utilize our voices, but to also understand that, again, our greatest natural resources is these young people. And if we cannot lose a generation based on the pandemic, we cannot lose a generation based on chronic absenteeism. I am back home in my hometown of Chicago right now, and I have never been more frustrated than to acknowledge what happened in my community just last week, where young babies were zip tied, where you had ICE officials come in at 2 a.m. in the morning and ravage people and drag them out of their beds. There isn't an inkling of humanity in someone who decides that that's what they need to do to enforce what they feel is an immigration platform. When I think of chronic absenteeism, I think of what I saw in those videos. I think of the fact that that was a building, the very same apartment building that I lived in before I moved to DC. And it has always been a building that was African American and Latino. And we coalesced around each other for years and were absolutely fine. For those young people to now be displaced, for their home to be disrupted, and then the expectation that they will show up in their public school on Monday and forget all of that is completely ridiculous and asinine. We have to be able to prioritize our young people, but also fight against a system that is predatory against families that are of mixed status or undocumented. Because in these United States, we care about all children. Our public education system is open to all children, regardless of their legal status. And here at EdTrust, we've partnered with several organizations that do that level of work in the community, but also in the states that we represent. Because what is happening, the laser focus that is being put on many communities of color, and is not only damaging towards the progress and access for those students, but also infiltrates the chronic absenteeism that Carl just spoke about a moment ago. Those are things we all have to fight together.
I would even say that some of the implications of what happened in that community, Amisha, those are the very things that lead to chronic absenteeism, as you said, right? But this level of fear being instituted in different communities is what will not can what will disrupt regular attendance, right? Uh, it will disrupt engagement because no one feels safe, and our school communities are not safe spaces right now after things like that. If they can come into your home, they can come into your school, right? You just parents, as a parent, I know that you have to be very careful with who you trust your child with. And most people feel like their child is safest in their presence when it comes to uh, instances like that. And so I can imagine the implications attendance wise. I can imagine the implications of larger issues around chronic absenteeism because my personal belief is the things that are happening with the attacks on immigration right now will just continue to exacerbate chronic absenteeism data nationally, especially for our students of color. And that will just be another reason for the administration to continue to divest in public education. And that's very unfortunate because it's almost as if they're creating problems to point at them later to say it's not working. And I think that those are the things that we need advocacy groups like Red, Wine, and Blue to spread the message of why we need to be engaged, why we need to demand accountability, transparency, and why we need to ensure that we are holding states and schools accountable to create safe spaces for students because we need to rebuild that trust with students and families.
I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to our wonderful host to make sure that we are not giving y'all too much, but are also being very respectful to the fact that all of you all joined and some of you have some really strong and pertinent questions, and we don't want to get in advance of that.
One of the things that, folks were asking is how can children feel safe in school with all of this going on? What are things that folks can do to try to foster that, to help that?
I think the first thing that can happen in a school environment, I would tell any school leader, any teacher that has students that are looking to them for safety, be honest. Don't pretend like the things that are happening aren't happening, because the students know they have their own conversations, their own networks, and what they need is adults who will be transparent with them, but also adults that they know that they can trust to keep them safe. And I know that a larger question, I've even had friends who are still teachers reach out to me, just saying, "Hey, from a policy perspective, if I help my students, what happens to me?" Right? And to be honest, it doesn't look good. But the thing is, there's a morality issue here. We know what's right and what's wrong, and we have to honestly just face the music that if you believe in keeping students safe, we have to be willing to commit to them, commit to their families, and ensure that if your students are in my presence, I will do whatever it takes to keep them safe. Right. There are some states that have issued guidance, like New York, Delaware, California, and Maryland, that have issued guidance on what districts are and aren't allowed to do in these instances. But they've also issued guidance on, hey, this is how we recommend you keep your students safe. And this is the commitment. These are the questions you can ask if someone is in your school community. This is how you are able to protect your students and families. So I think that those are some, we do have some models and we have some resources we'll drop in the chat later and share with you all on some work we did around that. But that's what I have to say.
I would also add to remember what got you into the role of an educator to begin with. Even though I am from Chicago, I went to public schools in the great state of Mississippi and the great state of Florida. They've been red for as long as you can remember. If you are a Black student in some of those environments, it can be a very uncomfortable place, and it was uncomfortable before Trump took office, to be quite frank. I had amazing teachers, and my teachers went out of their way to make sure that as a student who looked around my classroom, and there wasn't a ton of students who looked like me, I think in one class there was like two, um, to ensure that I felt comfortable in that class, that my voice was heard, that the types of books that reflected my community and my culture were seen. My 7th grade accelerated English teacher in Santa Rosa County, Florida, is still there now. This is her 35th year teaching in that school. And her thing is, I don't care what happens. Trump can say what he wants to say. The governor can say what he wants to say. What I am not going to do is put a target on the backs of Black and Latino students in my classroom. I never have, never will. That is not why I walked into this space. And I think that we have to have teachers who are bold in their advocacy, but are also understanding of their role in not only being the family for these students, but also keeping them safe and structured in those classrooms and not making them feel isolated. And that's a difficult thing to do, especially in this time frame. But I think that that is part of the role of and the oath that you take when you become a teacher. You have so many students that come from various different backgrounds. You don't get to control who you teach. And at the end of the day, part of that job is to not only teach them curriculum, but to also teach them life, to also help to guide them, to also be their mentors. I talk to that teacher every day. She hits me up on LinkedIn. She hits me up on Facebook. I don't even know how she finds me on all things social media, but it matters to your students. And there isn't a time that I am more happy than when I hear from that 7th grade English teacher, because for the kid who got bullied all the time, who felt out of place, the friend I had in that school building was my teacher. And I think that for so many young people today, that is what they need.
So, who do you think should be held most accountable for the harm being done? Is it state policymakers, local school boards, or federal leaders who've pulled back civil rights enforcement?
A little bit of everybody.
Mm.
And I say that full-throatedly. If you come from, various areas across the South, it's easy for you to blame your state legislators, and several of them need to fall on that sword. But we also have at the federal level people who talk about education and run on education, but the decisions they make don't look like education is put first. There is enough blame to go around. And at the end of the day, our children, the children that are in these classrooms today, cannot afford for you to point fingers left, right, and sideways. They need somebody to do something. They don't care whether that person is Democrat, Republican, you in red state, blue state, purple state. They need you to step up. So I think that for those of us who are in this field, for the people on this call who obviously are here because you care about education, you got to look at everybody in that room, because we didn't get here by just state leadership. We didn't get here just by federal leadership. We know what Project 2025 says. And in large part, Project 2025 was already happening in the states. That didn't start at the federal level. They literally adapted what was happening in the states. But what we do know now is that, education has always been the civil rights movement of our time. Always. That is not something that is new. And it has existed at the federal level and at the state level. We've always had folks who believe that, the best and brightest, the access only mattered for people who came from wealth and means. That is a frustrating reality, but that has existed for quite some time. What we don't want is for that to be codified in law. What we don't want is for our nation's babies, our youngest learners, to believe that because they did not come from a family of wealth and privilege, that there is no opportunity for them. That is the failure of this country. And I think that in as much as we can fight to ensure that no matter where you come from, that you have access to an upper rung, that is what we're here for. So the blame game, we could do that all day long. I don't think it is very beneficial. I think that what we need to do is lay everybody's feet bare, because there are a lot of people here who could take that L, but the people who really matter the most in this discussion are our young people.
I was doing some research over the weekend, and I was looking up some information on Generation Alpha for a school assignment, which I guess it ends this year. So it started in like 2011, 2012, and ends this year. And it said that that was the largest generation we've ever had in what I was looking at. And it's like 25 times bigger than the baby boomers, which is just mind boggling to think about. And it got me thinking about these topics, why they would be going after, because they're the kids who are in elementary school right now. So, I mean, some are in middle school too, but they're the first line in elementary school. And it just got me thinking, is this why they're doing this? Because they're so large, they're going to be harder to control. That's a fairly large group for them to, mess up their education now so that they're easier to manipulate when they're older.
Well, it's also because, there's and this is my non-EdTrust hat. There is also a concerted effort to bring back manufacturing to America. And at the end of the day, you need a worker class. And that worker class has historically been people who did not have access to education. And I think that what we're seeing is this push to put younger people back to work. And we've seen several states that have actually introduced legislation to ensure that people who are 12 or 13 years old can enter the workforce. That's not because they want to help poor families. It's because they want to bring back an era where your children did not have opportunity and access to get an education to be able to compete for some of these other jobs. And don't get me wrong, there's absolutely nothing wrong with people who work in factories. I come from a family of blue collar workers. On that same token, I also come from a family who said education is a way out and you do not have to do this. So we want to be able for children to be able to choose their pathway. And that pathway, if they want to work in a factory, great. If they want to do, advanced manufacturing, amazing. But if they want to go on to be a doctor, a lawyer, a social worker, if they want to go on to be a teacher, which I think is one of the greatest professions, by the way, that should be something that's accessible to them as well.
So where are you seeing bright spots right now? Districts, schools, or communities that are getting it right despite these attacks?
I would love to know right in general or right in spite of the political climate right now.
Right, in spite of.
I would just name a few of the states that I would say California. They are standing 10 toes down. They're committed to protecting students. They've got policies in place, and they're what I'm seeing from California too is leadership from their state leaders. And I think that's really important. We know that leaders are the ones who show up when there are problems, right? Problems that seem too difficult to solve. And I feel from a policy standpoint and from a media standpoint, I'm seeing them voice their desire to protect students and to protect families and communities. I would name some of those other states I named from a protecting students who are Latino or other students of color who are attacked via these ICE raids in their communities, such as New York, Maryland, Delaware. I think that those are also some states who, from a policy standpoint, are trying to issue guidance and support school communities with how they can support families and make them feel safe. And so those are the spaces that I would name.
So, for those of us who care about public education and racial equity, what can we do at the local, state, or national level to effectively push back?
Raise your voices. Make sure that you're
Mhm.
organizing in your communities. And I say this because, it's easy to name the large urban centers where you have Democratic leadership. Of course, they're doing some things that probably aren't possible in some of our, much more red states and red areas. Again, I lean back on being a kid who also went to school in Mississippi and Florida. I will say, everybody talks about the Mississippi Miracle and what they've done in literacy, and kudos to them. It has been amazing. It took 15 years. So I don't know how much miraculous that is, but it took 15 years, and it's great that they got to where they need to be. Most recently, though, and this article was written just a couple of days ago, the Rankin County School District, which is the school district I graduated high school from, they are a 90 plus Republican district. It is, if you're a Democrat, you ain't getting elected there, bottom line. However, they have fought tooth and nail against the voucher access debate, in large part because they have strong public schools. They have public schools that the parents love, that the kids love. They've had presidential scholars, they've had Coca-Cola scholars, they've sent people to some of the largest rungs of Ivy League institutions because they believe in their teachers and because their teachers have the training necessary to be able to and equipped to work with students with special needs, to work with students with disabilities, to work with students of various backgrounds. I would argue that in this era, regardless of where you live, regardless of the political structure where you are, you have got to be courageous enough to say enough is enough. Where we've seen people say, hey, we're not teaching about MLK. We're not taking on the PragerU curriculum that tells us that, slavery was a workforce development program. We are not out here to lie to people about where they are and what we stand for. And irrespective of where you live in this country, you have to be able to, one, assemble, because the truth lies in the structure of people being able to raise their voices. The only way we've ever achieved civil rights and equity in this country is by people like the folks on this call getting in the streets and making sure their voices were heard. So it's not all on the people who are the teachers in the classroom. It's not all on the structure of the school system itself. It is also on community members to recognize the power within their voices and the power in number, because that is the only way we've ever been able to achieve justice in this country. And it's the only way we will continue to.
Someone mentioned Christian nationalism in question. So, how does that play into all of these attacks on education as well? And how would you fight back against them? I mean, I guess standing up to them is about one of the best ways, but that they're really trying to be the powerful voice in the room.
I think we understand where it's coming from. Christian nationalism also drove the rise of the KKK. Christian nationalism has driven rise of very unfortunate and quite frankly tragic moments across American history. Christian nationalism led to the Waco crisis. Christian nationalism has driven some of the most disgusting and vile things in American history. And as someone who is a Christian, I grew up Baptist. As someone who believes in the Lord, and I ain't gonna preach to y'all on this call because that's not what we're here for. I think that we can have that conversation without making people feel as though their religion is wrong. And I think that sometimes, from a messaging standpoint, it is done in the wrong way. We can believe in the Lord, but in the family I grew up in the household I grew up in, I can believe in the Lord and pray to God, and somebody else can pray to something else. And that's absolutely fine. You may not pray at all, but I'm going to respect you just the same. I think that we have to have an understanding that, the melting pot that is America, there are people who come from various different backgrounds and various different belief systems, and we aren't pressuring anybody to take on the belief system that we have. On that same token, we have to also recognize that drive towards religious extremism, because I think there's a very strong difference between religious extremism and just having a faith. What we're
Absolutely.
seeing is a structure that is driven by religious extremism that says that there's only one way to go, and that one way is white Christian nationalism. And white Christian nationalism has always been anti-woman. It has always been anti-black. It has always been anti-Semitic. It has always been anti-Muslim. It has always been othering. We have to consistently fight against that, because that is not of the Lord, and that is not within the Old Testament or the New Testament that any of us read.
Somebody did ask this question. I do want to address it. They have grandchildren who live in a district that's not, the district that they actually live in, and they wanted to know, would they be able to speak up at the school board level for their grandchildren? And of course, my answer is yes, because I've done it in districts where I had no children there whatsoever.
Absolutely, 100%. How do you think Moms for Liberty got their start? Half of them don't have kids in any of the school districts they go in. They spread their messaging in. No, I think that part of the fight is to fight the right with the same fire that they fight us with. It doesn't matter whether you have a kid in the school district or not. You still have a priority to make sure that these students have the accessibility and the ability to not only achieve but to also grow and to thrive in their communities and to thrive in those school structures. And again, circling back to how the other side is, weaponizing, most of the people who speak, who show up to these hearings and show up to these different meetings, some of them don't have kids at all, but the overwhelming majority, especially when we talk about the people who are leading the book bans, they did not have kids in those districts at all. They were just going around to different districts.
I also think collective community accountability is important, right? You still have a vested interest because those are your grandchildren, but it's really important for all members of the community to have a vested interest in holding these school districts accountable, holding our states accountable from an education perspective, because that would just largen the audience who is advocating for just the correct treatment of our students.
Thank you so much. It was really great to meet you tonight, Carl. Red, Wine, and Blue works in coalition with lots of different organizations such as EdTrust. I saw Amisha present, and I was like, I messaged her like immediately in the chat, like, you've got to come talk to Red, Wine, and Blue, and I'm sure you all can see why we wanted her here. So thank you so much for joining us, both of you. We appreciate your time and all of the information. Good night, everybody.
Thank you all for having us.